Hello, everyone. Welcome. I see a couple of folks trickling in. I'm just going to share my screen with everyone. All right. So nice to meet you all. My name is Sage. I'm going to be running the webinar here. A couple of things that we're going to be covering today. I'll be talking through basic and advanced features of UXPin, such as auto layout and design systems. And then we're also going to go through interactivity. So UXPin has a lot of really amazing types of interactions that are available, such as conditional logic, variables, and I'll make sure to touch on that today as well. And then the last thing that we'll be covering is the Figma integration. This is new to UXPin. So if you're using Figma or you have a couple of files in Figma, it's really easy to bring those over, and I'll be sharing that with you all today as well. Before we get started, you'll notice that there's a chat down below. Feel free to add any comments or feedback that you might have, but for any questions that you have, just drop it in the Q&A and we'll make sure to address them as well. All right, so let's just go ahead and jump into it. I'll be kind of covering this in 3 pieces. So before I get right into the product itself, I'm going to just do a quick high-level overview, especially for anyone that's not as familiar with UXPin. And then we'll jump into an app that we built and share that conditional logic and a little bit more of a deep dive into UXPin and what's possible. So just to give you a little bit of an overview of us and who we are, UXPin has been in the design space for over 10 years. We were actually co-founded by designers themselves. And so a lot of time and effort has been brought into UXPin to be able to create a process that is for designers and that helps bridge that gap between design and development. So I have a couple of examples here that we've built out. These are all prototypes in UXPin where you can go in, be able to interact with it, test out multiple different user flows, like this stepper, for example. You can see that the total changes based on how I interact with the prototype. So we're able to start getting more real prototypes that are going to feel like the end product here in UXPin. And the main thing that I want to just address is the difference between UXPin and other tools that you might be familiar with on the market, such as Figma, Sketch, InVision, Adobe XD. These are all from the print paradigm. So you're still going to be working with those vector raster-based graphics. We're still going to be building out static or flat designs and kind of working off of that artboarding process, right? So we're going to have one user flow that's established, and then you might have to build out multiple different use cases to be able to reflect what's intended. And what I've found, at least when I'm speaking with other teams, is the impact that that has on the designer and developer collaboration. We hear that there's a lot more feedback loops that need to happen. A lot of time is spent just trying to align on what's intended in design and what actually gets built out. So UXPin is a code-based tool, and what that means is that you are able to create that interactivity. We're able to do stuff like that stepper example that I just shared with you, being able to bake those interactions in and start creating an experience that feels real. And what this does in turn is it allows us to get better feedback. We're able to bring in stakeholders, have them add comments, be able to test out multiple different user flows, and really get a true understanding of what's going to be built out into production so that we can get the necessary feedback that we need and be able to build products that are more accurately reflected of what design wanted. And so all of this is to foster that collaboration under one system and start bridging that gap between design and development. This is what the current design and developer process looks like today, or at least the ideal version of it. But what we're finding is that what's actually happening is essentially teams are working in silos. So you might have a designer building from scratch from a specific style guide that development doesn't have access to, or vice versa. And what happens is that there's actually friction taking place at every single part of the design process. It's not only that handoff. I always hear from people like chucking it over the wall to development, and we're finding that that's not actually what's happening necessarily. It's happening all the way from the very initial brainstorming of design through to building from scratch from a designer's perspective, or leveraging libraries that development doesn't have access to. And then we end up with this sort of pixel pushing between teams. And that's where we start to see that gap getting larger and larger. And so by having a code-based approach and being able to create that interactivity, being able to have a single source of truth under one tool, that allows teams to eliminate that back and forth that teams are typically having, and be able to create a more centralized process. So that's a bit of a high level overview of us and who we are. And I think that that'll set a really good foundation of what I'm going to be talking about today, which is a little bit more exciting. We're going to go through some examples. I'll share and speak to the designer experience. So I have this quick app here, and you can see that if I type directly into the account, we have some conditions that have been made. So I'm not actually able to go to the next page unless I fill this data out. And let me zoom in and just want to make sure that everyone can see this okay. So I can type my name in and we'll see that it changes. So let's type this out. But because I don't have my work email within this specific parameter, I need to have an @. Then I can type that in, and it allows us to go to the next page. You'll also notice that the data that I inputted here is reflected in the next page. And so that's utilizing variables in UXPin, which I will share today on how you can do that. But you'll notice that if I go back and I typed in a different name, for example, when I go to the next page, that name is reflected. So you can start testing out multiple different use cases and user flows. And this is really great, not only for the handoff to development, but also for any stakeholders that are involved in the process, gathering feedback, being able to do all the user testing. That can all happen right here in UXPin. And in addition to that, in this preview link that you can share across to any team member, they don't need to have a seat in UXPin. You just need to copy and paste this link, and they'll need the associated password. But once you pass that link over to your stakeholders with the password, they'll be able to have access to this and be able to test it out. In addition to testing it out, we have these comment features. So you'll notice that we have public and team comments. I can also notify specific members if I wanted to. And public comments are going to be available to anyone that doesn't have a UXPin license. So in addition to that, you also notice that we have these team comments. So for any internal back and forth that you might have, you can just add it to this preview link here, and then those won't be showcased to any stakeholders. It'll be internal only. In addition to that, we have spec mode. So for your developers, they'll have access to all of the different specs and redlining. We can see all the different colors that were used. I can click into a specific element or component. And you'll notice that this black banner pops up when I select this element over here. Whereas if I select another one, it doesn't. So that lets your developers know that this is actually a part of a library. This is a component that is associated to a specific design system. And your developers will be able to see exactly which design system that is and even click out into it if they wanted to. So we start to have a bit more of a centralized process. And it really helps for designers too, because you don't need to pass as much information over to your team members. They can have it all here in one place. All right. And the last page that I have here is this page with a bunch of cards. And I'm going to use this as an example of how you can use our auto layout feature and how you can also be able to pull multiple different designs very easily. So let's go over into the editor and I'll kind of share a couple of examples that we've talked through today. So for those of you who aren't familiar with UXPin, I've just clicked into a specific prototype here. So if I wanted to go back, I could open my dashboard and that will show all of the different prototypes that I have available. But in this case, I've clicked into a page, and a couple of things to note quickly is that over here on the right-hand side, we have this properties panel. So we can adjust the canvas size. We can also add our interactions, colors, typography, all of that is going to happen here. And then I have my tools panel. So this is really useful as you're wireframing and building out your designs. We even have these forms available. So you have those input forms that we had just seen with this sign up. And then you can also choose from like multi-select buttons and things like that. And then over here on the left-hand side, I have my pages. So this is where it's a little bit different because we're not working in the way that you would with artboards. We're working on pages. So I can click through these different pages here and we can see through interactions, we were able to link these pages together. We have our layers here, as well as our libraries. So if I go down to the bottom here, you might have caught that I had leveraged that other component from the Quick App library. So I'm going to select that. And we can see all of our text styles, assets, as well as components here. So we can leverage these however we'd like to and just drag and drop them onto the canvas. So going into the actual prototype itself, you may have noticed that it's a little bit wonky. And that's because I wanted to share the power of auto layouts. So with auto layout feature in UXPin, I'm just going to highlight this here. And you'll see the auto layout feature that we can choose from. And it automatically adjusts everything. And furthermore from that, we can actually change gap if we want to. Go in, you could change the direction. In this case, we don't want to do that. But you have a lot of flexibility with our auto layout feature to be able to just quickly prototype and get things set up the way that you need to without having to kind of pixel push and adjust things. So if I click into my button, for example, that we've built out, this is where we've added quite a few different interactions. In this case, if I select my button, you can see on the right-hand side that I have 5 interactions set. And this is where we were starting to create that interactivity of gathering the data, being able to pass our variable through to the next page, as well as have those conditions set. So if I just click out here, you'll be able to see these variables. And these variables, it's very easy to set up. You just need to select new variable, and then you can even associate a default value. For example, with that stepper that we had seen previously, the value was set to, I believe it was like $200, so that anytime a user selected the plus sign, it would go up $200 or vice versa. So something to keep in mind. And I'll click back into that button and we can see how we were able to set this up. So here, what we've done is that when the user clicks into that element, you can set the variable of the name variable that we had to the content of this input field. So anything that the user puts into that input field, it's going to now be the variable. This is also true for the email as well. And when it comes to having those conditions that we set up, it's very easy once you know how to do it. But in this case, what we've done is that when the user clicks that button to go to the next page, we'll say that when the user clicks, we have all of these different conditions that have been set. And you can add as many conditions as you want, so you're not limited in any way. And in this case, we've said that when the user clicks and this input field is empty, we won't let them go to the next page. So as long as it isn't empty, then we will, and vice versa. So we have these 3 different conditions that are set, and then the action is to go to the next page. Then we have this else statement. So if any of those conditions aren't true, then we will say that when the user clicks the button, we're going to show that error message that says, please fill in with data. So that's an overview of working with conditional interactions, being able to add that logic to your prototypes that help make them feel more closely to an end product. So I'm going to go over to the next page here, and we'll go into the email sent. One thing to note is that due to auto layout that we've set up, that's why we were able to keep that exclamation mark at the end of whatever variable that was passed through. So in this case, I passed through my name and then another example name, but it didn't affect the way that it looked on the next page because of auto layout. We were able to have it automatically adjust for you. You may have also noticed that we have these grids here. So I've added that grid just so that I can make sure that everything is lined up the way that I want it to and where I want it to on the canvas, similar to this here. You have the option to have multiple different grids if you want to, and you can also adjust all the different parameters of it as well. So I have this component that I have added from my library. Well, in this case, it's just a group. So I'm gonna actually ungroup this element, And we can see that it's composed of an icon and then two different shapes that we've added. And when you do want to group elements together, you can just highlight them. And then at the top, you'll have all of these different options here. So you could even create this as a component if you wanted to. In this case, I'm just going to group it. And I could go in and make changes to this if I wanted to. But if we want to go a step further, because the group helps if we want to move things around, right? But if I wanted to go a step further and add this as a component to my library, what I can do is go over into my next page here, and I can add this as a component. And when you do that, you'll notice that now we have a master component. And so from here, I could just drag and drop directly onto the canvas. It has everything set up the way we want it to. This is also true for if I were to have any sort of interaction on this, like for example, a hover state. All of that interactivity would be passed through when you're dragging and dropping it from a library. I go over into edit master. This is where we can start making changes to the component. If you have a global change that you want to make across all of your components, you can definitely do that. So I'll select those changes, go back, and then you can see that that component that was also from the library is now also reflecting those changes. And you can either choose to push it to the library or pull it from the library. And if we were to push to the library, we'll make changes across all of our different prototypes. You can also click into these icons, and this is a part of a library. So we have these icon libraries here that you can choose from. Maybe we want to add this little guy to it, or we can make adjustments here. So that's fully up to you, but you can definitely have those changes be reflected using the icon library in UXPin. I'm noticing a couple of questions. So I'm just going to address those really quick. Do designers need to learn how to code in order for this to work? No, not at all. I'm really glad that you asked that. You do not need to know code to be able to leverage this. I kind of like to think of UXPin as sitting right in the middle between something like Figma and then something more complex like maybe Webflow if you're familiar. But the difference between both of those tools is that with something like Webflow, you do kind of need to know or have some sort of understanding of code to get the most out of it. And that creates a very steep learning curve for designers. That's not the case in UXPin because it is based off of interactions. The only difference is that now you have the ability to leverage interactions, create conditional logic, but it's still going to feel very similar to how you might experience another tool like Figma or InVision. And especially Acture, if you're familiar with that tool as well. All right. So going to the next page here, we have this card view, and I'm gonna just kind of run through this pretty quickly just to be cognizant of time. But with the card, what you can do here is drag and drop it from the library, make those updates. And then I'm on a Mac, so I'm just selecting my Alt button. But from here, we could create multiple different cards and have all of the data be updated and passed through, but in different versions of itself. So we have like down the rabbit hole and the lobster quadrille. Those are all things that you can pass through very easily. using a feature in UXPin. So I do want to speak to the Figma integration as well as merge. And I'll run through these rather quickly, but if you have any questions at all, please feel free to reach out to us. We'll be following up with information after this call. So if you have any additional questions or need anything, just let us know. So merge is a feature in UXPin that allows teams to leverage real coded components and bring them into UXPin. So the way that this is set up is through the Git repository. You can bring your existing design system into UXPin. So now designers can work with already coded and functional components. So I have this example of a card that we'll use. Drag and drop that onto here. Let me zoom in. And so within this card, it already has some parameters set up. These are properties that have been set, and you can make this as rigid or as flexible as you need it to be. But what's cool about this is that it's composed of multiple smaller components. So I can go in, make adjustments if I want to. And now if I open up that preview link, it's going to reflect actual code for your developers to be able to leverage. And this is a very, very high level overview of merge. So if it's something that might be interesting to you, you can always reach out to our team and we can walk you through it in more depth. But this really does help streamline the design to developer handoff, because now developers have access to real code. And as a designer, you didn't need to build out code. You don't need to be familiar with it in order to work with coded components. All right, so the last and final thing that we'll be talking through is the Figma integration. It's very simple, really easy to do. So I just have one of these frames highlighted from Figma, and I'm gonna right click. And if we go from plugins to development, once you have the plugin, you'll be able to export to UXPin. So I'm just gonna select that. And now we can go back, copy and paste. And now our Figma frame was brought over to UXPin. And so this will include all of the different layers here. So you can now start building up from your Figma files, right? We can add that conditional logic. I can add an interaction linking to another page. I could even set the content of something if I wanted to. All of the interactivity is available to you, and it'll bring all of those Figma files over, as well as have its associated layers here as well. So I see quite a few questions coming through. Let me just double check. Awesome. Is there already an interaction in Figma that will be brought over to? The interactions in Figma are limited that it would be brought over. So, but the benefit of that is that you'll have all of your layers and frames, and you can just quickly add that interaction in UXPin. All right, so I know we're just at time. Thank you all so much for joining the call today. I really appreciate it. Again, if you have any additional questions or if you would like to see more, we're always happy to hop on a quick call. But other than that, I hope everyone has a wonderful day, and we hope to speak to you soon.